Welcome to another episode of Information Return Intelligence, the fast moving weekly podcast where we talk about all things 1099 related and anything else in the information return world, 1042S, W9, etc., etc. Today I wanted to talk about the draft versions for 2026 of Forms 1099-NEC and 1099 miscellaneous. As of the airing of this podcast on February 3rd of 2026, these 1099s are still in draft status. They have not been released for real yet for 2026. So we'll go through the drafts here, what this is all about. Some of this we've talked about already, about tips and overtime. I mean, that if you were to stop listening here, which you should not, but if you were to do that, it's tips and overtime is the gist of it. So if you're watching on YouTube, you can see the image here. So the IRS, now this is just a draft, but it's the 2026 version. They have added 3 new boxes. And on the NEC, it's right here at the top. What used to be box 1 is now 1A, non-employee compensation. And then 1B is cash tips. 1C is the tipped occupation code. And 1D is overtime. So on the miscellaneous, it's the same 3 items that have been added. They've just added it in a different spot. So on the miscellaneous, it's 13A for cash tips, 13B for the Treasury tipped occupation code, and box 14 for overtime. Now let's talk about what that means, those 3 boxes. We've talked about this some in prior episodes. It's the new, as per the big beautiful bill, OBBB, a deduction on personal tax returns for qualifying tips and qualifying overtime. And this took effect in 2025. Reporting by employers was optional in 2025. It'll be required in 2026. So that's what this is all about. Now, here's the thing. Tips and overtime, most of the time, will be a W-2 item. So if you are involved with the W-2 function in your organization, or your organization issues W-2s, even if you're not involved in it, you should make sure whoever the applicable party is, whether that's you or someone else, the applicable party here would be who's doing the W-2s, who processes payroll and keeps track of these things. Payroll needs to know this stuff for W-2s. When would a 1099 come into play? Well, not very often, especially with overtime. So overtime, let's start with that. Overtime has to be paid under Section 7 of the Fair Labor Standards Act. That's the federal labor law that says that if you are an hourly worker and you work over 40 hours in a work week, you're entitled to overtime, at least time and a half on those extra hours. There are some other definitions under Section 7 of FLSA for law enforcement and certain healthcare workers where the measurement period for determining whether or not you get overtime is different from a 40-hour work week. But the bottom line is, if Section 7 of FLSA applies, then the overtime counts as qualifying overtime. The recipient can take a tax deduction for it on their personal tax return. Now, FLSA covers employees, not contractors. So when would a contractor, when would you ever put overtime on a 1099? We talked about this in a prior episode about how you can have a worker who's considered an employee by the DOL, but a contractor by the IRS. That would be very rare. In fact, I don't know if that any of you listening to or watching this would ever have that happen. But it could happen. I've never encountered it, but I have read articles by labor law attorneys through the years that kind of dual status can happen. It's not totally a hypothetical. So that would be the circumstance where you're paying FLSA overtime to someone who is considered an independent contractor for federal tax purposes, and you would issue a 1099 to them showing their qualifying overtime. Then you have the tips reporting. So qualifying tips for this deduction on personal tax returns are tips paid in cash or charged to a card, paid voluntarily by the customer, and paid to someone, like the recipient of the tip, working in an industry where tipping is customary. So your 1099 reporting on that would again be if you happened to have a dual status recipient of tips. That would be pretty rare. But sometimes you might pay a tip to a contractor. And then you would need, if you're paying tips to contractors, you would need to look at the Treasury Department list of occupations. There's 68 different occupations that they list where tipping is customary. You would have to see, does my contractor work in one of those industries? And if the answer is yes, and you paid them a tip, you would need to report that separately on their 1099 and also include the tipped industry code that your contractor works in. So it's an added layer of complexity. It's an added layer of thought that's going to have to go into your 1099s for 2026, in particular with tips. If you have anyone who's not an employee who's getting tips, or if you're that rare circumstance where you think you might have workers who are employees in the eyes of the DOL, but contractors in the eyes of the IRS, that would be another circumstance. That'll do it for this week's episode of Information Return Intelligence. I'm Jason Dynason saying so long till next week.